Good morning. This is Dr. David A. Paget. This is a recorded lecture for the Geography 4850 Urban Geography course for May 18th, 2021. So today we are going to start off as usual with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll get right into the presentation. So I'm going to share the screen and just a couple of announcements. First, a couple of upcoming events. Tonight at 6:00 p.m., there's a live webinar about the Clotilda, the last slave ship to America and the start of Africa Town. The registration link and more information about the program is posted here at the news portion of your class e-learn page. So again, this program should give you some content as you continue working on your class term paper. We are currently working on the Urban Heat Islands mapping assignment. And so you have an opportunity to attend a webinar entitled "What Happens When You Go Hyperlocal: A Legacy of Inequitable Heat Exposure in U.S. Cities." That will be tomorrow at 11:00 a.m. Central Time. If you're able to see it, great. But it'll give you a little bit more insight into the work that we're doing on assignment 6. So I just wanted to make note of those two upcoming events. So today I am going to give you record an update on the urban climate vulnerability global to local scales assignment. And so I'm going to start off with this presentation. So this whole issue of urban climate vulnerability not only impacts cities in the United States, but it has possibly larger impacts in developing countries. So this presentation will cover some of the dynamics of global urban climate vulnerability. Then we'll look at a case study in Nashville, Tennessee. So we're going to look at this from a global scale and a local scale. And then we're going to look at some of the projects that I'm working on right now. And then I'll look at some career and research resources for you as you matriculate further if you decide that you want to do further study in this arena. This quote is from the World Watch Institute. 1 billion urbanites, or approximately 1/6 of the world's total population, currently live in slums, which are defined as areas where people cannot secure key necessities such as clean water, a nearby toilet, or durable housing. An estimated 1.6 million urbanites die each year to the lack of clean water and sanitation. And so clean water and sanitation are amenities that we take for granted in this country. We just expect to have these things. If you move to a city outside of Nashville, or even if it's a small town in this country, you expect to have clean water. And when you flush the toilet, the waste goes away. It doesn't reside with you. And so, but again, not everybody has these amenities. As a matter of fact, a lot of people lack the amenities that we have. Here are the world's largest cities as of 2021, and you can see that Tokyo is approaching 40 million people. Just to give you an idea, Tokyo is twice as large as New York City. And if you've ever been to New York City, that is a massive, massive urbanized region. And yet Tokyo is twice the size of that. But Tokyo is not growing nearly as fast as places such as Delhi and India and Dhaka, Bangladesh. So we might, Japan is an area that's seeing slowdowns in terms of growth. These other cities do not. Notice our second largest city, Los Angeles, California, isn't even on the top 20 list, just to give you an idea. So, and these cities are growing. Urbanization has been on the rise for the last, the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. We're seeing this trend, and the trend has resulted in um, the majority of people on Earth living in cities, and so that is a new phenomenon. That now we have more people in cities than in rural areas worldwide. And so the problem is that a lot of people in these cities uh, do not have uh, safe access to the amenities that I mentioned before. And as a result, we see that there are a number of health issues that are going to increase in a negative manner. Let's go through some of the critical issues. One is rural to urban migration. And so rural to urban migration is the trend in many parts of the world. Uh, that's different from where we are. In the United States, North America, or in the developing world, for the most part, the migration pattern internally for each country or each region is urban to urban. People move from one city to another. So when you graduate from Tennessee State University, if you decide to go to graduate school or medical school or whatever, chances are you'll move to another city. It might not be as large as Nashville, or it might be larger than Nashville, but it will be an urban area. In other parts of the world, people are moving from rural to urban areas. And so that's what's driving urban growth. In migration, we have pull factors and push factors. Pull factors are things that pull people to places. So, for example, in a rural to urban migratory pattern in a developing country, uh, one obvious pull to a city would be economic opportunity or perceived economic opportunity. Also, what would pull people to cities in developing countries is access or better access to healthcare. And so we live in a country where we have pharmacies on nearly every corner. We have uh, hospitals, medical clinics everywhere. In other parts of the world, a person might have to walk hundreds of miles just to get to a understaffed, under-resourced medical clinic. And so if a individual falls ill, or if a individual's child falls ill, they'll make that walk. And so that would drive or pull a person to a city. Push factors in some cases are related to the environment and closely tied to climate change. So at the bottom of the list, we have deforestation and desertification. Deforestation is when human beings uh, harvest trees, cut down trees at a rate faster than the trees can grow back. And this is what that deforestation is happening all over the developing world. In some cases, because people in other parts of the world still use wood, not electricity, not natural gas, but wood as their primary domestic energy source. And so there are also economic drivers to deforestation and so on and so forth. Deforestation occurs especially around cities where you have concentrated numbers of people who might be living in unplanned settlements who are still using wood. If you watch the film um, Flight of Flamingos, you'll see women in Kenya cooking outside on open fire using wood. You'll see it. What is desertification? Desertification is the ruination of soil by human mismanagement. Uh, Desertification coupled with drought, and a drought is a period of time when there's below average rainfall. So human beings have nothing to do with drought. Desertification is when we mismanage soil. We overgraze soil. We don't allow soil to recover. We use it for agricultural purposes to the point that there's no nutrients left. And after a while, the soil just blows away. We had desertification here in the form of the Dust Bowl. So if you go back and read historically, during the early part of the 20th century, 20th century in this country, we had an environmental disaster called the Dust Bowl, where we mismanaged land. We mean the United States uh, mismanaged land in the Great Plains region and destroyed the soil. And there were some instances where it was reported that in the middle of the day in Washington, D.C., it would look like midnight. It would be that dark in Washington, D.C. from the dust blowing from the Midwest. We, of course, have rectified that by creating rules via the Soil Conservation Service. And so, but when deforestation and desertification occur in the developing world, that pushes people away from where they live. Uh, when soil ruination happens in the developing world, people are unable to eat, and they will be almost forced to leave where they happen to be living. And so that those are other push factors. So when this crush of humanity descends upon cities, what often happens is called over urbanization. That's when we have cities that have more people than the city's infrastructure can support, more people than there is water supply, more people than there is sanitation, more people than there is housing, and so on and so forth. That's called over urbanization. And over urbanization in places that have a lack of clean water and sanitation has significantly negative impacts upon human health that were described in previous slides. Uh, Again, inefficient waste management, inefficient water supply, inefficient sanitation just results in even more negative impacts upon human health. And the parts of cities that are growing in the developing world are these unplanned settlements. And there's much greater socioeconomic inequality in other parts of the world. Certainly, there is socioeconomic inequality here in the United States, where we have maybe 1 to 5% of the population holding almost all of the nation's wealth, with the other 95% of us scrambling for that last maybe 5 or 10% of wealth in this country. But there is a middle class that exists here, um, that lives a reasonably comfortable lifestyle, as opposed to other parts of the world where there's a very small oligarchy of wealthy people and just masses of people who are living in poverty and in a very small middle class. And that middle class in other parts of the world, by our standards, would be probably poor, or low income, very low income by our standards here. So going back to the models of urban structure, most cities in the United States, because of automobile ownership, develop along the lines of the concentric zone model, which we've analyzed and assessed and discussed previously. Right now, you all are looking at Atlanta, Georgia, in terms of the urban heat island effect. Atlanta is more of a multi-nuclei city here at sea. In the developing world, cities follow the sector model. The automobile does not have nearly the influence upon urban land use development in the developing world, because people just don't have cars the way that we do here. I mean, we have more cars in the United States than we have licensed drivers. In other parts of the world, there might be one car for every 1,000 people, right? Or maybe 50 cars for every 1,000 people. And so therefore there's not this spread. They don't have the sprawl that we have. So there's people have to live a much more closely in closer proximity to their um, needs and resources such as food and work and so on and so forth. So we tend to see a different model. This is a model of Accra, Ghana, and so uh, some things are the same. You know, Accra has a central business district, just like, and if I was to show you a picture, if you were to Google downtown Accra, it would look very similar to the CBD in any U.S. city. But notice that the city is laid out in these sectors. There's not these rings, and that's because even the um, upper income uh, population has to live in close proximity to the CBD and commercial and industry industrial land uses. Um, One thing now, this is Accra. Accra is a relatively advanced city for much of Africa, and so they do have something similar in terms of this sprawled residential development of upper income in the suburbs, which is very much unlike most cities in the developing world. But if you remember, I believe Ghana gained its independence in 1957, and so they were ahead of the curve as far as many African countries that eventually gained independence during the 1960s. Now, this historic district is not an historic district in the sense of, let's say, old Sacramento in Sacramento, or underground Atlanta, or Beale Street in Memphis. The historic district in African cities or in Latin American cities is where there was architecture that was there prior to the advent of European colonialism. So a lot of people are led to believe that there were no buildings in Africa until Europeans showed up. That is absolutely untrue. So that's what that historic district is. Some of the structures are thousands of years old on the African continent and in Latin America. But speaking of Latin America, let's move to the Latin American city structure. And as you can see, again, we have more of a sector model. In this case, this pink area is where we would find the favelas or the slums. Uh, and in terms of ratio, if we look at any city in the developing world, the percentage of the population that lives in these unplanned settlements, slums, et cetera, can be as high as 50%. Um, Compare that with a city like Nashville, where maybe 1% of the population lives outdoors, unhoused. Um, so out of 600,000 people in Nashville, maybe 2,000 are living outside, similar to the conditions that we would find people living in slums. But in Sao Paulo, in Lagos, in many cities in the developing world, in Mumbai, there, out of those cities that have, say, 20 million people, perhaps 5 million of them in developing world countries are living in unplanned settlements. And so that is an extremely perilous situation. And those portions of cities in the developing world are growing. Um, Here's a shanty town in South Africa. This water here, that could be a mixture of rainwater and human waste right there. If you look at these shacks, probably no indoor plumbing, some piecemeal electrical lines here. But these electrical lines might not necessarily be serving these homes, maybe not. And in these homes, typically there might be multiple generations. There might be 9 people living in this shack, or 7 or 8 people living in a 300 square foot space with no privacy. Right. So and here's a favela in Brazil. So favela is the word for slums in Brazil. Houses perilously on the slopes when there are hurricanes or rains in this part of the world. There are frequent mudslides and landslides, and obviously people in these favelas, these structures are not able to withstand liquefaction of soil, and they'll just come right down this hill with no warning. And many people are killed like that all the time in Latin America. It's almost the opposite of this country. In our country, poor people live in the lowlands, the bottoms. Wealthy people live up in the hills, right? It's the exact opposite in Latin America. So speaking of issues in cities in developing countries, here's a article about the water issue in Mexico City. It says after waiting, the caption of the image here says, after waiting for more than 5 hours at a water distribution center to get delivery of her weekly ration of water, Raquel Villanueva, 31, prepares to wash her dishes at her home in Mexico City. Many of the city's 20 million people get by on as little as 1 hour of running water per week. So again, we take water for granted. We just get up in the morning, turn the tap, turn the spigot on the shower, don't even think about it. In other parts of the world, just getting that is a arduous task, hours standing in line, and then you don't get a whole lot of water. And that's in Mexico City. This is not in some rural area out in the countryside where you would expect for there to be lack of infrastructure. That this is in the city. And so if we continue to look around the region here in Latin America, we start to see that water supply is starting to dwindle in many parts of the world. And so we're facing a crisis, especially in urban areas. And so as you can see, oftentimes it's the women's job. It's the women's traditional task to get water. So as a woman in the developing world, you might spend a substantial portion of your time, whether you're on the Indian Peninsula or on the African continent or in some parts of Latin America, you might spend an extensive portion of your time getting clean water from wherever you get it from. And that's because we human beings cannot survive without water. And so water obviously is part of the hydrosphere and part of the atmosphere. And so as more and more people move into these tenuous communities in urban areas worldwide, and as climate change continues to have a greater and greater impact upon us, those two issues are on a collision course at presents challenges for us as a human race on this planet. As you can see, this quote from the United Nations, managing urban areas has become one of the most important development challenges of the 21st century. Our success or failure in building sustainable cities will be a major factor in the success of the post-United Nations development agenda. So this issue, global urban climate vulnerability, is one that is definitely on the radar of the United Nations. And so now we're going to go to a case study analyzing and assessing urban climate social vulnerability at the local scale in Nashville, Tennessee. So first, we're going to take a look at this from a qualitative standpoint, from an educational standpoint, and then we're going to get more into a quantitative look at this issue. So now we're coming back and looking at urbanization and climate on a local scale here in the United States. So we're learning that climate change has a definite impact upon human health in terms of respiratory health, in terms of survivability, getting access to clean water. If with climate change, droughts become longer, that's going to affect people in cities. If with climate change, flooding and hurricanes become more intense, that's going to affect people living in cities. And so urban heat is just one of the threats that comes along with climate change. But in our country, as you're are studying or looking into in assignment 6, this urban heat island is problematic as our cities here continue to grow, and as we continue to build over the green space, resulting in these heat islands or this kind of heat dome on this graph that I showed you the other day, and that you are looking at in map form with the GIS project that you've been assigned. And so again, this problem is significant because, as you've learned, heat is the deadliest weather hazard. Not tornadoes, not hurricanes, not flooding or lightning, but heat. A lot of people don't realize that, and so and we see that it's a significant problem. And so, as climate changes, we're going to see more. Maybe not a greater, maybe not a greater um, number of extreme weather events, but those that occur are going to be more intense precipitation, more intense floods, more intense hurricanes, more intense tornadoes, and so on and so forth. So that is the issue is not with greater occurrence, but with greater intensity. And so we see that flood magnitude in cities is going up. So now cities are looking at flood mitigation, and a variety of ways to protect people from flash floods. And you can see the trends are that we have more and more heavy precipitation events occurring than we ever have before. For example, maybe going on 16 years ago, Hurricane Katrina occurred on August 29, 2005. And Hurricane Katrina really alerted us, or really woke people up to how the existing evacuation strategies for cities especially in the coastal region of the United States, that evacuation strategy had to be re-examined. That obviously people in certain socioeconomic segments of urban areas are a lot more vulnerable and are very much exposed if they're unable to evacuate. And they have to shelter in place for long periods of time. And so the Red Cross, after Hurricane Katrina, the Red Cross and other social services agencies and organizations started to engage in what were called inner city emergency preparedness trainings and workshops. And so the idea shifted to sheltering in place as opposed to assuming that everybody could evacuate. So the Red Cross went around doing these inner city emergency preparedness workshops. At one point, they came to Tennessee State University, and during the workshop, I asked the Red Cross representative, "Where are the Red Cross shelters in Nashville?" The person responded that they're all over town, but the Red Cross, the Nashville chapter, did not have a map. They did not have a map of their shelters, and so at the time, or just prior to this, I had successfully written a State Farm insurance company Good Neighbor Service Learning Grant that I used the $15,000 that was awarded to build a GIS lab at Pearl-Cohn High School. So I told the Red Cross representative, I have some ninth graders at Pearl-Cohn who are going to work with my students at Tennessee State University, and we're going to make your map. So that's what happened with this project called Mapping Nashville's Red Cross Emergency Shelters with Geospatial Technology, a Pearl-Cohn High School and TSU community engagement partnership. So we identified the 37208 zip code area, as you've heard about the 37208 zip code area in this class, as being a potentially vulnerable population for a variety of reasons. 93% African American as of 2009, significantly higher percentage than average of people relying upon public transit than in the rest of Davidson County. 16.5% have no vehicles available. So we can easily see that this population would have a very difficult time evacuating in times of emergencies. About 66% at or below the poverty level. Now, this was as of 2009. A lot has happened in the 37208 zip code area since then in terms of gentrification. But at the time, that's what this was a situation. So students in the weather and climate course and in the urban geography class after that were tasked with training these ninth graders at Pearl-Cohn High School. You can see Pearl-Cohn's demographics: 93% African American. Now it's 100% of the students qualify for free and reduced lunch programs. So this is a typical inner city high school. We work primarily with the ninth grade academy. And so here's one of my students here presenting the Teaching the Levees curriculum based upon Spike Lee's Emmy Award winning documentary, When the Levees Broke. So we got the ninth graders or enhance their awareness of extreme weather events and obviously the impact upon urban areas, with Hurricane Katrina being the ultimate case study. And we use online learning modules for the high school students to learn GIS. And so just here are the weather and climate and urban geography students. Normally this would have been you in a classroom here in Nashville, working directly with ninth graders and or some other grade in what we call near peer learning. And I've mentioned in here in many cases that a lot of these young people, they might have all the talent in the world, but if they don't see themselves in college, if they don't see somebody that looks like them in college, they might not see that as a viable goal, even if they are clearly capable of going to college or doing something productive. So when they encounter college students who aren't that much older than they are, they can see themselves being in college, and in many cases, the HBCU students kind of blow away the stereotype of what a high school student might think an engineering major might be or a science major might be. They might see somebody in science and engineering or math as being a nerd or not cool. But because at HBCU you all are able to hold on to whatever culture you have, for better or worse, and still be in sciences, these students are taken aback and say, well, wait a minute. I thought that I would think a biology major would be somebody really geeky and nerdy and goofy, but for the most part, HBCU students aren't the Stephen Urkels of the world. Nothing wrong with Urkel, but a lot of people don't want to be Urkel, and so we really wanted to have that close contact with our college students, and here they are working in the lab, and so using GPS receivers, and the students learned about GPS, and they took what the Red Cross had. So this is what the Red Cross started out with: just a list of shelters on a PDF file. This is what we got. And the shelter data were converted into Excel spreadsheets. So this is exactly what you all are doing. and then built the master spreadsheet here. And then we created the first maps of Nashville's Red Cross emergency shelters. Now, what was interesting was if we go back to that 37208 zip code area, notice that there was a lack of coverage in terms of Red Cross shelters. And so the Red Cross had no idea that this disparity existed. And so that's why mapping is important. That's why looking at things spatially is very important. When we see things on a map, sometimes we see things that we've never noticed before that were within a table full of data. And so that's the power of using mapping in many cases. So the Red Cross, to their credit, um, gave the students credit. You know, a lot of times children do things, the young people do things, and adults take the credit. I mean, the Red Cross didn't say we discovered that we had a deficit of shelters in the 37208 zip code area. No, they gave these young people credit. I know for a fact that this uh, Matthew Edwards, he went to, I think he went to Howard first, but he wound up at Tennessee State University. I'm assuming he graduated. I know he took a GIS class or two. And this young lady, she went to UT Knoxville, and I think I saw her in a news story recently, like a really positive story. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think she got um, she's obviously much older now, probably close to 30 now, or maybe late 20s. But so we saw these students move forward and do some really positive things. The Red Cross, in part in response to what these young people did, immediately uh, connected or partnered with the National Baptist Convention, which is probably the largest African American religious organization in the U.S. with over at least 10 million members uh, and 16,000 churches to begin to establish uh, Red Cross shelters in partnership with these churches. As you can see, 85% of Red Cross shelters are maintained by faith-based organizations. So it was a perfect partnership. And also, what happened was a breakdown in communication. The community, what happened that resulted in the deficit of shelters was a breakdown in communication. The Red Cross, I guess, expected people to come into their doors and volunteer to become Red Cross shelters. And the people in the community expected for the Red Cross to show up in their communities and, I guess, recruit people to be Red Cross shelter managers or what have you. Of course, neither one of those things happened. And as a result of that breakdown in communication, there were no shelters. But the Red Cross did go to work right away and attempted to rectify that, to their credit. So that was in 2009. Well, less than a year later, we had a 500 to 1,000 year flood event in Nashville, the Nashville flood of 2010. You can see some of these stats. Probably the saddest, of course, is that 26 people lost their lives in this flood. The 37208 zip code area was significantly affected and impacted. You can see some of these images from the flood. And speaking of Black churches, um, in this case, this is an AME church. St. Paul AME Church during the flood became an impromptu emergency shelter. So, now Representative, uh, Reverend Dr. Harold Love Jr., who is a TSU alum and is mother worked at TSU for a long time, maybe almost 60 years, literally. And I think his father also. But um, his church at the time, St. Paul AME Church, wound up being an impromptu headquarters for almost every emergency agency you could possibly imagine. And he had no intentions of doing that. He was going there to maybe provide some meals. And this church is within the area of Bordeaux in the 37208 zip code area. But this is an example of, again, how a Red Cross shelter at a faith-based institution would operate. But this was not a Red Cross shelter. This was an impromptu emergency shelter. But sometimes many are called and few are chosen. Right. And so during the 2010 flood event, one of the things that happened that was not too good was that North Nashville, which had significant flooding, did not get a lot of attention at first. Most of the news cameras were out in Bellevue and Pennington Bend and out in the more suburban areas. Same kind of flooding and impacts and suffering was happening in North Nashville, and there just wasn't a lot of news coverage, not a lot of attention. That was just a very bad thing. Even in the aftermath of the flood, the recovery efforts were not equitable. Many people concluded or felt. So the first part of the analysis of community vulnerability focused upon one community, and that was the 37208 zip code area. I teamed up with Dr. Nia Fotheringham, who was a physician at Meharry Medical College at the time, to look at a larger view of community vulnerability, of urban community vulnerability to extreme weather events, looking across the entire city. And so what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is a degree to which communities are potentially affected by hazards. And the risk is the probability that those hazards will occur. And so communities that have, higher susceptibility to hazards are deemed to be the most vulnerable. The question is, well, how do we quantify that vulnerability? Looking at Nashville, Davidson County, flooding is our highest risk hazard and the highest in terms of vulnerability for Nashville's population. So we were going to, again, expand this to looking at Davidson County, identifying communities that were vulnerable in general and vulnerable to flooding specifically. And so we also wanted to see what kind of access these communities have to to shelters, and finally make some recommendations based upon our findings. So first, we had to have a method to identify and rank community vulnerability. Which communities were more or less vulnerable than others. And so we used the Social Vulnerability Index. The Social Vulnerability Index, also called the SOVI, is a methodology for determining relative vulnerability of populations based upon specific criteria. The criteria are 28 variables obtained from the Census Bureau and then converted into map format. The SOVI was created by Dr. Susan Cutter, a geographer at the University of South Carolina. It's since been adapted by all kinds of people, including the Centers for Disease Control. So here are some of the variables that are used in the SOVI. You have race and ethnicity, age, socioeconomic data, gender, cultural characteristics such as language, people per unit of housing, and so on and so forth. And so these are percent of housing units with no car. That's a vulnerability. And so we assigned a social vulnerability score to each of Nashville's census tracts using, at that time, ArcGIS 9.9.3.1. And we were trying to look at which communities were more vulnerable than others. So this is one of the first maps. This is the uh, socioeconomic vulnerability, social demographic vulnerability. And so the red regions are those that have the highest vulnerability. In that red area right in the center, that's the 37208 zip code area. So that's exactly what we expected. But this is just looking at socio-demographic factors. This is not all of the factors that we utilize. Here is the wealth vulnerability. So obviously, this map was very revealing. So here's a 37208 zip code area, and in around the downtown Nashville, the I guess the zone 3, we would expect to see uh, people more vulnerable due to their lack of wealth. I mean, I guess that's what these red areas indicate. But if you notice, as we move out into the suburbs, we see quite a bit of poverty extending, or low income, into the suburbs. And so that's something that is a trend that, or was a trend that continues probably to this day, as we discussed and examined in class. Uh, Now, the ethnicity and industry vulnerability is a combination between, obviously, people's ethnicity, or whether or not English is the first language spoken in the home, and the type of work that they do. And it just so happens that a lot of people who are not who are foreign born, or who might be first or second generation, especially first generation immigrants, tend to work in the types of jobs that can be easily affected by a natural disaster. So they might be engaged in uh, farming, agricultural activity. They might work in hospitality, in restaurants, in hotels, and we clearly saw that with the pandemic, where those populations were either if they either they lost their jobs, or if they continued to work, they tend to be at greater risk of being exposed to COVID-19. So when we speak in terms of vulnerability, we're speaking in terms of vulnerability to anything, including the pandemic. In this case, we're looking at flooding. So the SOVI, and I want to point this out, the Social Vulnerability Index is an index or an indicator of vulnerability, period, not just the flooding. So I just wanted to make that point. So you notice that in the southeastern sector of Davidson County, Nashville, that's where, if you go down Nolensville Road, if you go out Murfreesboro Pike, uh, in that area of Antioch, there are a lot of foreign-born people there. And a lot of people don't realize that Nashville is a very diverse city in terms of, international cultures. And that is because for a long time, really up until the Trump administration, maybe I'm sure things are going to change. Um, Nashville has been a major refugee resettlement site. And so there are people from all over the world here. There are Kurds, there are Somalians, there are Sudanese, there are pick a country that has had some kind of strife where people have been persecuted, and a lot of them are in Nashville. A lot of people don't realize that. And of course, once Nashville became seen as a city that is friendly to foreign-born people, more and more of those individuals have come to the city. Um, in fact, in 1990, I believe Nashville was 1%. Latinx. By the year 2000, Nashville was 7% Latinx. By 2010, Nashville was 10% Latinx. Now 2020, who knows? So that poor segment of the population has been growing. Here's age. Now, age is kind of tricky because with age comes wealth. So you notice that in the southern part of Nashville, Green Hills, Oak Hill, Forest Hills, Belmead, these are the wealthiest parts of Nashville. They're also the oldest population in Nashville. But you also see what we want to look for are places like Edge Hill. So notice Edge Hill has uh, a high percentage of senior citizens, but it's also a low income area. So these are areas of age vulnerability that we want to focus upon in terms of mitigation or some other form of public assistance. So here we have housing vulnerability. And so obviously housing vulnerability is based upon the value of one's home in some case or housing status. And so you see that is pretty much everybody is vulnerable, perhaps except in these areas where you have a lot of college students and a lot of renters in and around inner city of Nashville. This is the composite map. So this is a map of all the factors. And notice that when we put all the factors in, that 37208 is not the most vulnerable area. And this was a surprise even to us. We thought the whole time that 37208 zip code area was going to be the most vulnerable population to disasters and hazards, but it's not. It's this zip code area, this census tract here in Antioch that wound up being the highest. And so if we look at that most socially vulnerable tract, there are about 3,000 people in the tract. 46%, almost half, are Hispanic or Latino or Latinx. Almost half had less than a high school education. I think on average, 80% of people in Tennessee have a high school education. So that is about close to half of average. 28% had no transportation, no cars. So, and then 87% are renters. Why are renters vulnerable? Because they have no rights to their property in times of disaster. And actually, what happened in Antioch was a lot of foreign-born people lost their homes that they were renting, but were still being charged rent, which is illegal. Once a property becomes uninhabitable, it is illegal for a landlord to continue to ask for rent. But if you're foreign born and you're either not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to cause trouble, or maybe who knows, or maybe you just don't understand, maybe you can't really interpret the lease, and the landlord says, well, it's right there in the lease, you can't read the lease. And so so a lot of those people were actually basically conned or scammed into paying rent for months after the flood until they got legal intervention. And so to some degree, being a renter, once you lose your home, if you don't have renter's insurance, or maybe even if you do, you're not going to get a replacement of your home if you happen to be a renter and you lose it. So here are some of the disparities that we saw. The most vulnerable tracts were 70% of people of color, much higher rates of poverty, much lower income, $47,000 per year less, 4.5 times more like unemployment rate was higher by 4.5 times. The median household value was $300,000 less than the least vulnerable tracts, 4 times more likely not to have a car, and 14 times less likely to speak English proficiently. So here is the most damning evidence that we found in this study. So the highest proportion of shelters are located in communities with moderate social vulnerability. So most of the shelters are in communities that did not have the highest vulnerability, just moderate. But in the least socially vulnerable communities, the communities that had the most resources, the evacuation capacity was 19%. But in the most vulnerable communities, the evacuation capacity was less than 1/3 of 1%. So in the places where people were probably uh, most able to evacuate, most able to leave, most able to get into a car and drive away, they could still hold almost 20% of those folks. In the communities in Nashville where people were more likely to not be able to leave, not have any place to go, uh, they could hardly hold any part of that population there. And so we made Nashville, all the emergency management agencies aware of this disparity. This was really also shocking to us. So this is the power of GIS, the power of using geographic information systems to make ourselves aware of certain things that we might not necessarily see um, with the outside of a map platform or format. So here is a layer of the Red Cross shelters with the final map and the inundation zone of the 2010 flood, which is a perhaps 1,000-year flood event. And you can just from a casual observation standpoint, you can see that the most vulnerable tracks in many cases were uh, affected by the flood, as we saw here in one of our results slide. Recommendations, we need to diversify the languages that disaster preparedness documents or pamphlets are written in. Um, uh, where there has to be more of a educational, more of an effort to educate people on sheltering in place, those who are not able to evacuate immediately, and also for populations that are especially vulnerable, say elderly populations or people who are on dialysis, people who might need additional assistance. There should be a registry of people who are most vulnerable. Uh, Elderly people are very vulnerable because it's very difficult for them to evacuate because they may be injured or actually die during the evacuation. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, the majority of the deaths were senior citizens, elders who were unable to evacuate. Some of them drowned in their beds in retirement homes and senior citizens communities. Um, there's a whole aspect of flood insurance, and a lot of people uh, had a false sense of security that because they were not located in their homes inside of the 100-year floodplain that they were safe. But Nashville literally is located in a bowl, a geographic bowl that's surrounded by a topographic high called the Highland Rim. So yeah, there's a propensity for flooding to occur here, and so people really should think twice about not having homeowners insurance, even if they're not required to do so. So people who have homes within the 100-year floodplain are required to have flood insurance, or at least required to be notified that they should get flood insurance. Um, then, of course, there's reinvestment in the housing stock, and this whole idea of housing affordability and an equitable quality and availability of affordable homes is just another issue that shows its face here also. Um, and again, I talked a little bit about the buyout programs. In some cases, or in most cases, buyouts are tied to a home's appraisal value, which might be significantly lower than the money that it would take to rebuild. So a person's home might be appraised at $90,000, but it might take $200,000 to rebuild it. So what do they get? What can they do with that? Right. So let's look at some urban climate vulnerability projects that I'm working on right now, along with Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright, um, who are at the, well, Dr. Beverly Wright is director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and Dr. Robert Bullard is considered to be the father of environmental justice. He's at Texas Southern University, or as we say, the other TSU. So we are working in a variety of communities in Pensacola, in Alabama. Of course, you all know about Africatown. We've talked about Turkey Creek community. You've heard about the Lower Ninth Ward community in New Orleans, and so on and so forth. And so there are several historically Black colleges and universities involved, and we, the faculty and students, are providing technical assistance in a variety of areas to help these communities improve their quality of life, and in a variety of ways. So we were working, and we just had a workshop a week ago where all of the communities were looking at flood maps and attempting to educate themselves on how to best be prepared for flooding and how to best engage in mitigation from flooding, and really how to be proactive in working with their local governments in flood mitigation and management. The Wedgwood community in Houston, Texas, we're looking at a variety of contamination issues. This community is surrounded on three sides, surrounded on by 13 landfills, and so there are a variety of negative externalities that might be impacting the Wedgwood community at any time, including air pollution. And you can see here we're looking at particulate matter exposure in the Wedgwood community with this map. Water pollution, flooding, a variety of issues are impacting the Wedgwood community. And of course, with climate change, we expect to see more rain and more larger and more intense hurricanes in all these cities along the Gulf Coast. Of course, when it comes to flooding, New Orleans, Louisiana, but even after Katrina, there are always floods in New Orleans. And so there are many, many, many efforts in place, from wetlands mitigation, even urban wetlands mitigation and urban wetlands preservation to prevent flooding from occurring in the city of New Orleans. And so we're working with, so in your case, there are a lot of opportunities out there for you to engage in careers in climate change, although most of you all appear to have your mind set on some in the medical field. But I know we have at least one civil engineer and one health science major in the class that might be interested in using geospatial technology. And so here we have, looking at a global scale, again, as we mentioned, that this urban climate vulnerability is going to be occurring globally, and it's going to be exacerbated by global warming and climate change. And so here's a case from the 2019 cyclone in Mozambique, and of course, the United Nations is looking at geospatial technology as a way to further its efforts and objectives. And so if you have a desire to work outside of the US, there are opportunities to do so if you get some background in geospatial technology. Again, engineering, while there are great problems up front, there are solutions, and there are many technologically based solutions uh, through engineering, uh, both locally and globally, to mitigate the impacts of global warming and urbanization at the same time. And so there are lots of opportunities for engineers to make contributions in this area. Obviously, geosciences, earth sciences, there are going to be lots of opportunities there for individuals such as myself. I'm a geoscientist, earth scientist with a background in hydrology and atmospheric science, and I'm working every day with communities and urban areas to mitigate the impacts of climate change and flooding. And so one of the challenges that we have at Black colleges is that we don't really have a large representation of geoscience and earth science programs. And so I'm working with people to make those changes, get more, we have two National Science Foundation grants at Tennessee State University. One of them is called Earth Horizons. It's a partnership with Vanderbilt University, where Vanderbilt, that does have a geoscience program, teaches classes at TSU, and but TSU students pay TSU prices, not Vanderbilt prices. So that's the Earth Horizons Geopaths project. So there are a variety of ways that that earth scientists can contribute to mitigating some of these impacts. There's some organizations. There's a National Association of Black Geoscientists, which is a really strong organization, well funded, lots of scholarships, very family oriented. And even if your background is not specifically in geoscience, if you have an interest, if you're looking at global warming, if you're looking at the relationship between human health and climate, there are opportunities for you to become involved with this organization. This year, we're going to have the 8th annual HBCU Climate Change Conference. And so this is a conference that I take students to every year, except for last year, of course. It was postponed. We are looking forward to meeting in, I believe, November or October of this year, in person in New Orleans. And so that's the plan thus far. Actually, October 6th through 10th in New Orleans. And if any of you all have projects that are related in any way to climate change, including the one about Africa Town, you can put a climate change twist on that. You might be at this conference. We'll see. American Meteorological Society has lots of opportunities for students, students from HBCUs, students of color, what have you. The annual conference, which probably the next one probably won't be until 2022, emphasizes students on the first 2 days. So here are just some of the examples of some of the research on urban growth and climate vulnerability. This topic has been at the forefront for a while. SOAR, Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science, is a summer internship program to diversify atmospheric sciences or geosciences. And so there are opportunities there. that program for summer internships. Stanford has university, as you saw, I did a presentation at Stanford. They have the SURGE program, Summer Undergraduate Research in Geoscience and Engineering. Lots of opportunities there. Spend the summer in Stanford University. I don't know, probably you're looking at 2022 now. Um, who knows what they've done the last year or so. Very good program for underrepresented population to get involved in geoscience and engineering. The Student Conservation Association has GIS-based internships for all majors. Obviously, the work is based in conservation, environmental conservation. And so this is an internship program to which I've sent a couple of students, and they were very good experiences. The SCA really takes care of their interns in terms of travel funds and housing and all of that. You know, you're not just left on your own to find housing and transportation and meals. Okay, so, and then of course, going beyond, there are opportunities with the United Nations, and then there's a Population Reference Bureau, which is a really good source for research, and then the World Bank, if you want to learn more about this topic. Of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, uh, is a great place to look if you're looking at the global status of cities in terms of adaptation uh, to climate change. I do want to make a point about that. So, a lot of people talk about, well, what is the difference between mitigation and adaptation? Adaptation is where we it's not as if we do nothing, but adaptation would be perhaps building would be more like moving inland, perhaps. Mitigation would be to build a seawall in front of a city. So the seawall is an interventionist mitigation to prevent storm surge from flooding a city. Adaptation is saying, well, you know what? Let's move away from the ocean. So, and there are arguments on both sides as to how um, we will deal with populations, especially in cities, who live in harm's way in terms of, of weather and climate related hazards. Do we continue to repopulate these areas knowing that we're going to get flooding, knowing that they're going to get hit by a hurricane? Or do we just vacate the premises and let nature take over? And so it's a very interesting argument. There are people on both sides that argue one way or the other as to which is the most efficient way to deal with climate change and urbanization. Here's just some more resources for you. I think maybe some of these might be in your reading list. Resilience Matters, of course, is another free resource. And so there are many resources out here that look at resilience and mitigation and adaptation with regard to urban climate vulnerability. Um, Always like to look at solutions. And so one area that's really booming on the continent of Africa in an effort to mitigate the impacts of climate change upon cities and urban areas in Africa is the development of solar power. Um, Most of Africa is in the tropical region, lots of sunshine all year long. And so this solar power is being used to support schools and, more importantly, support hospitals. I mean, when you heard that the COVID-19 vaccine, one of them has to be refrigerated. That takes energy. And so there's a lot of work that can be done in the solar energy sector. And that's more engineering and science. So internationally. There's a Dr. Wangari Maathai, who I was fortunate enough to meet before she passed away really prematurely in 2011, but she was the first African woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize, largely through her efforts in environmental conservation in Kenya, that eventually led to that country moving from war to peace. And you can the link there, or if you Google Wangari Maathai, there's a film about her life and her mission that's really, really good. And this is again, a way of looking at solutions to these problems rather than saying that, oh, we're just all doomed and we can just, why don't we just, do nothing and just give up. And so again, I just wanted to give you an updated version of the presentation that would include a little bit more than what's in the original presentation. So if you have any questions, please let me know. So again, no class meeting today. Just watch this recording and the other materials, and I will see you all tomorrow. Tomorrow being Wednesday, May 19th. Thank you very much, and enjoy your day.